The morning Marin Holt arrived at the Crow Ranch, the sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind came down off the Kansas plains like it had somewhere more important to be. She sat in the back of Silas Pruitt's wagon with her canvas bag between her feet and her hands folded in her lap, and she watched the land the way a person watches something they are trying to memorize before it disappears. Pruitt had not spoken to her directly since Wichita. He spoke about her, which was different, and which she had come to understand was the natural condition of her arrangement, the deaf woman, the mute, the one who would not cause trouble because trouble required communication, and she, according to Silas Pruitt, had none. She had agreed to the performance 3 weeks prior in a boarding house outside Cincinnati, in a back room that smelled of pipe smoke and old wallpaper, where Pruitt had laid out the terms across a table scarred by 30 years of similar transactions. Men like Thaddeus Crow, Pruitt had explained, do not want complications. They want function. You keep your eyes down, your ears closed, your mouth shut, and this arrangement works smooth for everybody. Marin had looked at him across the table and said nothing. Pruitt had taken that silence for agreement. It was the kind of mistake people made around her constantly, and she had long ago stopped being surprised by it. The ranch appeared at the end of a rutted track between 2 stands of cottonwood, and it was exactly what she had expected from everything she had heard on the ride from town. The fencing along the east side had been repaired in 3 different decades with 3 different levels of attention. The main house was solid but tired, the kind of solid that comes from a man who fixes what breaks and nothing more. A barn stood to the north with its doors open to the cold morning. Smoke came from the kitchen chimney. Somewhere behind the outbuildings, cattle moved with the slow, indifferent weight of animals that did not know they were the center of a financial crisis. Pruitt pulled the wagon into the yard and climbed down, and Marin climbed down beside him, her boots finding the frozen mud, her bag lifting easily in one hand. She was 28 years old and built like someone who had worked since childhood, which she had, wide through the shoulders and heavy through the middle in the way that made men like Pruitt use the word stout when they were trying to be generous and other words when they were not. She wore a work dress the color of creek mud and a canvas coat she had owned for 6 years, and she stood in the yard of the Crow Ranch and looked at it with the calm, unhurried attention of someone taking inventory. Thaddeus Crow came out of the barn. He was tall in the way that men who have worked alone for years are tall, carrying it without awareness, and he moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had stopped wasting motion sometime in his early 30s. He wore a coat that had been good once and was now simply functional, and he had a jaw that looked like it had been set against bad news for so long it had forgotten how to relax. He was 38 years old, and he looked like a man who had been keeping his own company for too long and had made a kind of peace with it that wasn't quite peace. He looked at Pruitt first, then he looked at Marin. His gaze moved over her the way a man reads a situation, not unkind, not kind, purely assessing. The way you look at weather coming in from the northwest and try to decide whether to bring the horses in before it arrives. Pruitt launched into his introduction without ceremony. Deaf as a fence post, Pruitt said, jerking his chin at Marin. Can't hear a thing, can't talk back, won't cause you a lick of trouble. She'll cook, clean, haul water, whatever needs doing, costs you nothing but a roof and 3 meals a day. Thaddeus looked at Marin for another moment. Then he looked back at Pruitt. She healthy? He asked. Fit enough, Pruitt said. Fine, Thaddeus said. That was the entirety of it. That was how Marin Holt was introduced to the place that would become the most consequential ground she had ever stood on. No name, no acknowledgement. A transaction completed in 4 words, and she was the item being transacted. Pruitt produced a contract from his coat. 1 page, spare and brutal in its simplicity. Room and board for domestic labor, no wages, no specified term beyond the season. Marin had read the contract 3 days ago and memorized every word of it, and found nothing in it that surprised her, which was itself a kind of information about the world she was moving through. She pressed her thumb to the bottom of the page. She did not blink. Pruitt folded the contract and put it back in his coat, and shook Thaddeus Crow's hand like a man who had just unloaded a broken mule at full price, which, as far as either man was concerned, he had. Marin picked up her bag. She had heard every word of every conversation on the ride from town. She had heard Pruitt tell the wagon driver that the Crow Ranch was carrying debt that would break most men. She had heard him say that Thaddeus Crow was the kind of man who worked himself to the bone and kept his head down and did not look up until the floor had already given way beneath him. She had heard the driver say that it was a shame, and Pruitt had made a sound that suggested shame was not a category he spent much time in. She had filed all of it away in the organized, methodical way she filed everything. Marin Holt had not been deaf a single day in her life. What she had been, for longer than she could easily count, was strategic. A young hand named Tolliver showed her to the bunkroom behind the kitchen. He was 19 and had the particular awkward courtesy of a young man who had been raised to be polite to women and was working out how that applied to a woman who could not hear him being polite. He pointed at things. He smiled too much. He left her at the door of the bunkroom with a nod that was trying to be reassuring. Marin set her bag under the cot. She sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at the ceiling and listened. She could hear Tolliver outside telling another hand that the boss had taken on a deaf woman for the kitchen. She could hear the other hand, a man with a ragged voice she would later learn belonged to Wick Reese, make a sound that was not quite a laugh but lived in the same neighborhood. She could hear boots on the main house porch and the low particular register of Thaddeus Crow's voice and Pruitt's higher pitch answering. She could hear a dog barking somewhere toward the south pasture. She could hear wind working at a gap in the bunkroom wall that she had already identified and was already thinking about how to seal. She lay back on the mattress and looked at the ceiling, and she began to pay attention. In the first 48 hours, she did not make herself useful. She made herself invisible, which was different and considerably more valuable. She moved through the ranch like weather, present and unremarkable, and she watched. The fencing along the east boundary had been repaired in 3 separate attempts with 3 different levels of urgency, which told her something about the rhythm of crisis on this property. The main house had a broken porch step that had been fixed badly and broken again, which told her something about deferred attention. The dry goods in the kitchen were stored in the wrong order for efficiency, which told her something about a man who cooked to survive and not to think. She noted the way Spur Giddens, the older hand with the gray in his temples and the permanent crease of worry between his brows, looked at the barn in the mornings with an expression she recognized as a man doing arithmetic he did not like. She noted the way Tolliver moved around Thaddeus with the particular careful alertness of someone who had learned that the boss's moods were weather that needed reading. She noted the way Wick Reese looked at everything on the ranch with a thin proprietary amusement, as though he had already decided the outcome of something and was simply waiting for the story to catch up to his conclusion. She filed all of it, without expression, without haste. On the 3rd morning, she reorganized the kitchen. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. She cleared the draft vent in the stove that had been partially blocked for what the grease pattern suggested was at least 4 months, working the blockage loose with a knife and her hands, her broad shoulders leveraging the angle that a smaller person would have struggled to hold. She had always been built for work that required force applied with precision, and she had long ago stopped apologizing for either the force or the frame that produced it. She rearranged the dry goods by frequency of use. She identified 2 staples that were missing entirely and made a mental note that resolved itself the following week into a quiet word to Tolliver before the supply run. She had biscuits in the oven and coffee on, before the first hand appeared in the doorway. That was Tolliver. He stopped when he smelled the coffee. He looked at the kitchen with the expression of someone who has walked into a room and found it rearranged into something better. He sat down at the table, and Marin set a plate in front of him, and he ate 2 biscuits before he took a breath and then looked up at her with something that was close to reverence. "Ma'am," he said, with a sincerity that made Marin turn back to the stove before he could see her almost smile. When Wick Reese came in, he ate without comment, which was its own kind of comment. When Spur Giddens came in, he wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and closed his eyes for a moment, the way men do when they have been cold for a long time and something has finally taken the edge off it. Thaddeus came in last. He sat at the head of the table, and the room arranged itself around him, the way rooms arrange themselves around men who have a kind of gravity, not because they demand it, but because it is simply there. He did not talk much. The conversation at the table happened around him rather than with him, the way water moves around a stone. Marin listened to all of it while she worked the stove. Spur said something in a low voice about cattle prices. Tolliver shushed him. Reese muttered something about Vane that made Spur's jaw tighten. Thaddeus said, without raising his voice, "That was enough." The table went quiet immediately. Vane. That was the second time in 12 hours she had heard that name. The first had been in the yard the night before, when she was sealing the gap in the bunkroom wall and could hear through the thin partition Spur telling Thaddeus that Vane's man had been asking around in town. She filed it next to everything else and went back to the stove and began planning the noon meal. On the 15th day, she found the ledger. It was behind a loose board in the back of the pantry, not hidden the way a man hides something he is ashamed of, but stored the way a man stores something he cannot bring himself to look at too directly. Marin found it while reorganizing dry goods for the second time. She recognized what it was the moment her hand touched the cover. She carried it to the kitchen table and opened it and read quickly and retained everything. What she found confirmed and expanded everything she had assembled from overheard conversations. The ranch carried significant debt, 2 liens, both held by a man named Cornelius Vane, structured with interest terms that were close to impossible to meet within the stated windows when cattle prices were what they currently were. The language in the second lien was careful and dense, in the way that language is careful and dense when someone has paid a lawyer to make it difficult to read quickly. Buried in it was a clause she read 3 times to be certain. Vane could demand full repayment within 30 days, at his discretion, for any reason or none at all. Marin sat with that for a long moment, then she turned to the next page and found the 3rd lien. It was newer than the other 2, dated 4 months ago, and it was structured differently. It was written not against the land itself, but against the water rights specifically. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of the Crow property, the one she had seen from the wagon coming in, was the primary water source for the entire north grazing section. Marin read the clause twice, then she understood. Cornelius Vane was not planning to take this ranch in one motion. He was planning to take the water first. A ranch without water in a Kansas summer was not a ranch. It was a slow emergency that eventually became a transaction at a price that suited the buyer and no one else. It was patient. It was precise. It was the kind of planning that came from a man who had done this before, who had stood outside properties like this one and understood that the fastest way to own something was not to take it all at once, but to cut off the one thing it could not live without and then wait. Marin closed the ledger. She replaced it exactly where she had found it, the same angle, the same position against the board. She went back to the kitchen and started on the noon meal and did not allow her face to show a single thing, but her mind was running hard. She had what she needed to understand the shape of the problem. What she did not yet have was the specific information that would tell her whether the shape of the problem contained a weakness. For that, she needed access to information she could not get from inside the ranch. She needed to get to town. On the 18th day, Tolliver drove to Delwood for supplies, and Marin climbed into the wagon beside him and pointed at her empty flour sack. Tolliver nodded with the accommodating cheerfulness of a young man who had decided she was all right, which was the only clearance she needed. She had 12 minutes while he loaded at the general store. Aldous Frick's office was on the near end of the main street, a narrow room with a window that let in the kind of light that made old paper look important. Frick himself was a man in his late 50s, with the careful, slightly watchful manner of a small-town lawyer who made his living knowing things other people did not know and being judicious about when to share them. He looked up when Marin came in. He registered her, the heavy canvas coat, the work dress, the calm, unhurried way she moved, and he made the automatic calculation that most people made when they looked at her, the calculation that placed her in a category and was already moving on before it had fully landed. Then she put a folded note on his desk. He opened it and read it and looked up at her over his spectacles. "You want to know about demand repayment provisions," he said slowly. "Specifically, the notice requirements for water rights liens in this county." Marin held his gaze. Frick took off his spectacles and cleaned them with the particular deliberateness of a man who is thinking rather than cleaning. Then he put them back on and looked at her more carefully, the way a man looks at something he has underestimated and is revising his assessment of in real time. "Sit down," he said. He talked. Marin listened with the focused attention of someone who understood she would only get one opportunity at this information. The demand repayment clause was aggressive, Frick said, but not unusual in instruments held by creditors like Vane. The more interesting question, from a legal standpoint, was the procedural requirements for the water rights lien itself. Those requirements were stricter than land liens. They required a certified survey and a specific notarized sequence of signatures filed within a narrow window after the survey completion date. "What window?" Marin wrote. 10 days, Frick said. "Under Kansas statute, the filing has to be complete within 10 days of the survey completion date, or the lien is procedurally defective and can be challenged." Marin wrote, "What makes a filing defective?" Frick looked at her for a long moment, then he leaned forward slightly, the way lawyers lean forward when something matters. "Miss," he said carefully, "I want to ask you something." Marin waited. "Who are you doing this for?" he said. She wrote, "Does it matter?" Frick almost smiled. He talked for 4 more minutes. Marin left with everything she needed and 30 seconds to spare before Tolliver finished loading. She climbed into the wagon and folded her hands in her lap and felt the first real shape of a plan settle into place in her mind. Not complete, not yet, but structured enough to hold weight. She was still building it on the 22nd day when the Reese situation happened. She had been alone in the kitchen for 20 minutes when he came in, tracking mud across the floor she had just cleaned with the loose, entitled ease of a man who had calculated that certain people in his vicinity had no recourse. He dropped into a chair at the table without looking at her directly. He said something without raising his voice particularly, the kind of thing men say when they believe the recipient cannot hear them, a remark about her size, about the space she occupied, about what a woman built the way she was built had any right to expect from the world. He delivered it with the particular amusement of someone who had made this kind of remark before and found it satisfying and had never once been required to account for it. Marin was at the stove. She did not turn around immediately. She had spent most of her life being looked at the way Reese had looked at her. The size of her had been, in the accounting of most rooms she had moved through, the first and often the final thing people knew about her. She had stopped fighting that accounting years ago. What she had learned instead was something more useful, that a large woman who stays quiet long enough becomes, in the minds of the people around her. something close to furniture, and furniture, in her experience, heard everything. She placed the pan she was holding on the iron grate with a steadiness that she maintained not by suppressing what she felt, but by understanding precisely that what she felt was not relevant to what she needed to do next. Then she turned and looked at Wick Reese directly, full face, without blinking, without expression. Not a challenging look, not a wounded look, simply a look that communicated, in the way that certain silences communicate things more clearly than words. That she was entirely present and entirely unafraid. Reese stopped talking. Something shifted in him, some recalibration, some unconscious understanding that the usual accounting did not apply here, and he straightened slightly in his chair in the way men straighten when they are no longer certain of the ground beneath them. The back door opened. Thaddeus Crow stepped in. He read the room in 1 second. His gaze moved from Reese to Marin and back to Reese, and whatever he saw in those two positions told him everything he needed to know. "Reese," he said, "get back to the fence line." Reese stood and took his coffee cup and left without meeting either of their eyes. Thaddeus did not immediately look at Marin. He crossed to the basin, washed his hands, dried them on the towel that hung from the nail beside it. Then he turned. He looked at her carefully, directly, with the particular attention of a man who is asking a question with his eyes before he asks it with his mouth. "You all right?" he said. He angled it toward her, clear and deliberate. "Not the way you speak to furniture." Marin looked at him steadily. She nodded. He nodded back. He moved toward the door and stopped with one hand on the frame, not with hesitation, but with the deliberate stillness of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether this is the moment to say it. "That won't happen again," he said. He said it the way a man states a fact he intends to make true. Then he walked out. Marin stood in the kitchen and felt something small and stubborn settle somewhere in the center of her chest. She told herself it was simply gratitude, which was practical and appropriate and did not require further examination. She turned back to the stove and told herself this again and almost believed it. 3 days later, Spur Giddens took a bad fall from the barn loft. He came toward the house holding his arm at an angle that said broken before his mouth said fine. Marin stepped directly into his path. She was not a small woman, and when she chose to occupy a doorway, she occupied it completely. Spur, who had been moving with the momentum of a man who intended to keep moving, found himself stopped by something that was not aggressive and not apologetic and did not appear to have any intention of moving aside. Spur was a man who had worked cattle since before Marin was born. He looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has just been stopped by a person they had not expected to stop them. "I'm all right, miss," he said. Marin held her ground and held out her hand. Spur sat down on the hay bale. She examined his arm with the methodical attention of someone who had dealt with working injuries for most of her adult life, probing carefully, reading his face for flinch lines rather than watching her own hands, bruising, swelling, a muscle strain serious enough to need support. Nothing broken, which was the best news available. She went to the kitchen and came back with a cold cloth and clean wrap and a salve she had been putting together from herbs gathered along the east property boundary over the past 2 weeks. She bound his arm tight and clean and stepped back. Spur flexed his fingers. He looked at his arm. He looked at Marin. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he said quietly. Marin looked at him without expression and went back toward the kitchen. She was nearly through the door when she heard Thaddeus say her name. Not "hey," not "you," not the silence that had been her primary form of address from most of the people on this property for the first 3 weeks. Her name. She turned. He was standing a few feet from the barn door, and he was looking at her with a look she had seen on his face twice before. that long, unsettled look of a man who is examining something he cannot quite categorize, something that refuses to fit in the place he has assigned to it. "That was well done," he said. "Spur doesn't let people touch him. Not for anything." He held the look for a moment. "I don't know what Pruitt told me about you," he said, slower now, something careful entering his voice. "But I'm starting to think most of it was wrong." He turned and walked back toward the barn. Maren stood where she was in the cooling evening air and felt that thing in her chest again, the one she had been calling gratitude, and she knew with the honesty she generally tried to apply to herself that it was becoming something considerably more inconvenient than that. She went inside. She had work to do. On the 25th day, while Thaddeus was in the south pasture and the hands were occupied with fence repairs, 2 men she had never seen before rode into the yard. They were well dressed in the way that people who work for money rather than labor are well dressed, and they carried themselves with the loose, certain ease of men who were accustomed to arriving places and having their arrival mean something. One of them had a leather document case across his saddle. The other was taller and looked at the property with a proprietary gaze that Maren recognized immediately, the gaze of a man who was already measuring things in his mind, already calculating what he would do differently. She was at the kitchen door when they pulled up. The tall one looked at her, and his gaze moved over her the same way it moved over the fence line and the barn roof. A rapid assessment of things he did not expect to be obstacles. He had already placed her in a category before he finished looking. "We're looking for Crow," he said, loud and slow, the way people speak to those they believe cannot understand them. Maren looked at him without expression. "Crow," he said again, louder. "The man who owns this place?" Maren shook her head. She pointed outward, made a vague gesture that could mean gone or away or I don't understand any of this. The tall man turned to his companion and said in a completely ordinary conversational volume, not quiet, not careful, because there was no reason to be careful in front of a woman who couldn't hear anything. "She's the deaf one Pruitt placed here. She doesn't know a thing." "Long ride for nothing," the companion said. "Not nothing," the tall man said. He looked back at the property with that proprietary gaze again. "Vane wants us to see the east boundary documentation before the notice goes out. Crow keeps copies in the house." "The notice," the companion said. "When?" "End of the week," the tall man said. "Vane decided there's no point waiting. Cattle prices are down and Crow's not making up ground. Better to move now while the man's already bleeding. End of the week." Not 30 days. Not the weeks Maren had been calculating. 5 days. Perhaps less. "House is probably unlocked," the tall man said, looking at Maren again with the expression of a man who has confirmed that the obstacle in front of him is not an obstacle. "She's not going to stop us." Maren stood in the kitchen doorway and kept her face completely empty and felt everything inside her go very still and very clear. She stepped aside. She was a large woman, and she used that now the way she used most things, deliberately. A large woman stepping back from a door looks like deference. It is not always deference. She crossed the main room in 10 steps, her weight moving with the quiet purpose of someone who knows exactly where she is going and has no interest in being watched getting there. The document cabinet beside the fireplace. She had cleaned around it for 3 weeks without opening it. She opened it now. Inside was a leather portfolio, thick, worn at the corners. She did not look at its contents. She tucked it under her left arm. She crossed to the kitchen, slid the portfolio behind the flour sacks on the lowest shelf of the pantry, and had her hands back on the counter and her face back to blank before the tall man appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the kitchen. He looked at her. He looked back at the main room behind him. "Where's the document cabinet?" he said. Directly at her, loud and slow again. Maren pointed at the empty cabinet in the main room. He walked over and looked inside. He crouched and checked the back. He stood and looked at the room the way a man looks at a space when the thing he came for is not in it. "It's not here," he called to his companion. "You sure Pruitt said the cabinet by the fireplace?" "That's what he said," the companion replied from the doorway. "Maybe he took them to the bank." "He doesn't need Crow's copies," the companion said. "He can get the documentation through the county. I want the margin notes," the tall man said. "If Crow's been annotating the terms, it tells us whether he's planning a challenge." His voice dropped slightly, but not enough. "Either way, the notice goes out Friday. Vane's done waiting." Marin stood at the stove with her back to them and her hands on the handle of a pot. She was not cooking anything in, and her breathing even, and her mind moving at a speed that had nothing to do with how still her body was. She heard the tall man's boots cross the main room. She heard them both remount in the yard. She heard hoofbeats receding north. She stood at the stove for 30 full seconds without moving. Then she retrieved the portfolio from behind the flour sacks and carried it to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside were the original ranch deeds, copies of both land liens, correspondence with a bank in the county seat, and then, beneath all of it, a letter from an attorney named Bertram Law, dated 8 months prior, the envelope sealed, the wax unbroken, unopened. Thaddeus Crow had never read it. Marin set it on the table and looked at it for a long moment. Then she broke the seal and read it in full. Law had identified a discrepancy in the witness signatures on the second lien. One of the two required witnesses had signed on behalf of a third party, which was not permitted under Kansas County filing regulations. Lawley assessed the lien as potentially voidable if challenged before a judge. He had requested a response at his earliest convenience. The letter was 8 months old. No response had ever been sent. Marin sat with the letter in both hands and felt the full particular weight of it, the weight of a man so deep in the daily work of keeping something alive that he had not opened an envelope that might have changed everything. Not because he was careless, but because carelessness was a luxury he could not afford. Because the cattle needed moving, and the fences needed mending, and the debt payment was due, and there was always something more immediate than a letter from a lawyer he had hired 8 months ago to look at paperwork. He could not bring himself to read too carefully. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She put the portfolio back in the cabinet exactly as she had found it. Then she stood in the kitchen alone and thought about a notice going out on Friday, and a water rights lien filed on a date she had not yet verified against the survey completion date, and a man riding the south pasture who did not know that the floor he was standing on had already been cut away beneath him. She went back to the stove. She had work to do, and the shape of what needed to happen next was finally becoming clear to her, and she needed time to be certain she was right before she could afford to move. She was still standing at the stove when she heard Thaddeus Crow's horse come into the yard, and she had her hands on the counter and her expression composed and the letter still folded in her apron pocket, and she understood that the moment for composure was almost over. Almost, but not yet. Thaddeus came in from the south pasture as the last of the light was leaving the sky, trail dust still on him, and something in his expression that told her the ride had not been reassuring. He pulled off his hat and set it on the peg by the door and stood at the basin washing his hands with the methodical attention of a man who needed something to do with his hands while his mind worked elsewhere. Marin set a plate on the table. He sat down and looked at it, and then looked up at her. That same assessing look, but slower now than it had been in the early days. The way a man reads something he has already started and keeps finding reasons to read again. She reached into her apron pocket and placed the folded letter on the counter beside the stove without a word. Thaddeus looked at it. He looked at her. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps and picked it up and unfolded it and read it, standing at the counter with the particular stillness of a man who is absorbing something that is rearranging things inside him as it lands. He read it twice. Then he lowered the letter and stood with it in his hand and looked at Marin with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the assessing look, not the careful noticing look. Something stripped back from both of those. Something that had been held in place for a long time and was, in this moment, not quite holding. "Where did you find this?" he said. Marin pointed at the document cabinet by the fireplace. "In my cabinet," he said. "It was in my cabinet." She nodded. He looked at the letter again. Laue wrote this 8 months ago. His voice had dropped to something close to quiet. 8 months. And I never... He stopped. He looked at Marin, and she could see the moment the full weight of it arrived. The realization that a path had been sitting in his own house, in his own cabinet, sealed and waiting, while he sold cattle at bad prices and made half payments, and carried the quiet particular devastation of a man who had begun to believe he was out of options when he was not. His hand tightened on the letter. "The second lien," he said slowly, "if the witness signature is invalid." He stopped again. He looked at Marin the way a man looks at a person when a question has formed that he is not certain he has the right to ask. "Marin," he said, "just her name. How did you know what that letter was?" The kitchen was very quiet. She could hear the wind working at the north corner of the house. She could hear Tolliver somewhere outside talking to the horses in the low, easy way he always did. She could hear the specific silence that meant Spur Giddens and Wick Reese were in the bunkhouse and not moving toward the main house. She held Thaddeus Crow's gaze, and she stood at the edge of everything she had been building for 25 days. The performance, the patience, the careful architecture of invisibility, and she felt the full weight of what it would mean to step off it before she was ready. Not yet, she told herself. Not completely. Not tonight. She reached for the notepad on the counter and wrote 4 words and slid it across the kitchen table toward him. He looked down at it. "I read. I notice." He looked up at her. Something moved in his face. Not suspicion exactly, but a recalibration. A man adjusting his understanding of something he thought he had already understood. He looked at the 4 words again. Then he folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I need to go to town tomorrow," he said. "First light. I need to see Law, and I need to look at those county filings myself." He paused. "I want you to come." Marin looked at him. "You found this." He said simply, "You ought to be there." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. He picked up his hat from the table. At the door, he stopped, giving himself a moment before walking out into the dark. "Lock up tonight," he said. Then he walked out. Marin stood in the kitchen and listened to his boots on the porch, and then in the yard, and then the sound of the barn door. And she thought about a notice going out on Friday, and a water rights lien she had not yet been able to verify, and a man who had just asked her to stand beside him without yet knowing who she was. She turned back to the stove. There was work to do, and there was not much time. And Marin Holt had never in her life let either of those facts stop her from doing what needed doing. She began. The next morning came in dark and cold, frost on the yard and the horses breathing steam in the pale light before sunrise. Thaddeus had the mounts ready when she came out of the bunkhouse with her canvas bag and the small notepad she kept on her person. He was checking the saddle straps with the focused mechanical attention of a man who needed something to do with his hands, while his mind worked through the problem ahead of him. He looked up when she appeared. He nodded at the second horse, a steady bay mare he had let her use on previous errands into town. He turned back to his own mount. They rode in silence for the first mile, and Marin let the silence sit because it was a working silence and not an empty one. The Kansas plain opened on both sides of the road, flat and brown and enormous under the early sky. The kind of landscape that does not comfort you, but does not pretend to either. She had grown up in Ohio, where the land had edges, and she was still adjusting to a place where the horizon simply continued until it became weather. Thaddeus rode with his hat pulled low and his jaw set and his eyes on the road, and she could see him thinking. The way you can see a man thinking when you have watched him long enough to know what his face does when he is turning something over and looking for the weak point in it. After a mile and a half, he said, not looking at her, "The Galt place." She waited. "Family lost their ranch 2 years back," he said. Vane held the note. It went fast, faster than it should have for a spread that size. Eustace Galt told me after that the paperwork had come together strangely, said it felt rushed, like someone was moving before anyone could look too closely. He rode another 50 yards before he spoke again. "I thought Eustace was just a man looking for a reason that wasn't his own fault," Thaddeus said, "a man wanting someone else to blame for his bad season." He adjusted his grip on the reins. "I was wrong about that," he said. Marin wrote on her notepad, holding it steady against the movement of the mare. Vane uses the same method each time, same filing pattern, same structure. Eustace Galt was not the first, and you were not meant to be the last. Thaddeus read it without slowing his horse. He read it twice. Then he said, quietly, "We need to see the county filings." "Yes," Marin wrote. "Today." They rode the rest of the way into Delwood without speaking, and the silence between them was different from the silence that had existed in the first weeks. It had weight and direction now. It was the silence of two people who are thinking about the same problem from positions that are closer together than either of them had expected to find themselves. Aldous Frick was in when they arrived. He looked up from his desk when the door opened and registered Thaddeus with the careful, neutral expression of a small-town lawyer who had learned to be measured around men with active debt disputes. Then he registered Marin, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition. Recalibration. A rapid reassessment of several things at once. Marin held his gaze and willed him to be careful. Frick was careful. "Mr. Crow," he said, looking at Thaddeus. "I understand there has been some recent activity from the Vane operation." "You could say that." Thaddeus said, "I have a copy of the law letter." Frick said, "Lawway and I correspond on county matters." He identified a genuine problem with the second lien, the witness signature issue. "How serious?" Thaddeus said. Frick folded his hands on the desk. "Serious enough that if you file a challenge before Vane issues his demand notice, you put him on the defensive, he would have to prove the lien's validity before he could act on it. That process takes time, weeks at minimum, possibly longer." Thaddeus leaned forward slightly. "And the third lien, the water rights." Frick paused. He looked, briefly, almost imperceptibly, at Marin. Marin looked back at him steadily. Frick looked at Thaddeus. "What do you know about the third lien specifically?" "I know it exists," Thaddeus said. "I know Vane is moving on it. What I don't know is whether it's clean." Frick was quiet for a moment. Marin reached across and wrote on her notepad and turned it to face him. "Survey completion date, filing date, 10-day window under Kansas statute." Frick read it. He took his spectacles off. He looked at Marin with an expression she recognized as the look of a man who has just understood that he severely underestimated someone he met briefly in his office on an unremarkable afternoon. "Miss Holt," he said carefully, "when did you determine this?" 2 days ago, she wrote. "From the figures in the ranch ledger and what you told me during my first visit, I calculated the window from both ends." Frick sat back in his chair. He looked at Thaddeus. He looked at Marin. He exhaled slowly through his nose. "Mr. Crow," he said, "I think you should know that this woman came to my office several weeks ago asking very specific questions about demand notice provisions and water rights filing requirements. I believed at the time she was making inquiries on behalf of someone else. I did not fully appreciate. He stopped. I appreciate now, he said, that she was asking on behalf of you. Thaddeus turned and looked at Marin. She met his eyes without flinching. The look on his face was not what she had prepared herself for. It was not anger. It was not the betrayal-adjacent reaction she had been quietly building defenses against. It had anger in it. Yes, around the edges. But the center of it was something that had nothing like anger in it at all, which was more difficult to navigate than any version of anger would have been. You went to see a lawyer, he said, quiet and even, before you had been on my ranch 3 weeks. Marin held the look and nodded. For me, he said. Another nod. Thaddeus looked at her for one long moment, then he turned back to Frick. The water rights lien, he said. If the filing date is outside the 10-day window. Frick straightened in his chair. If the certified survey on file at the county recorder's office shows what I believe it shows, based on what Miss Holt has calculated, then yes, the lien was filed outside the permitted window. A judge would void it on procedural grounds without needing to examine the substance of the claim at all. The procedure itself is disqualifying. I need to see that filed copy, Thaddeus said. County recorder's office, Frick said. I can walk you over now. But Mr. Crow, if Vane's attorney has already sent a preliminary notice inquiry to the county, and I heard this morning that something of that nature may have occurred yesterday afternoon, then you have very little time before he controls the timing entirely. Thaddeus stood. Then let's move. He looked back at Marin once, briefly, and the look carried something she felt across the room like a change in air pressure, something unresolved and complicated and entirely real sitting between them, like a question neither of them had time to answer yet. She walked out behind him. The county recorder's office was 3 blocks and 1 turn from Frick's building, and they covered it at a pace that was not quite running because Thaddeus Crow was not the kind of man who ran in public, but it was close. The recorder's office had 2 clerks and the particular compressed atmosphere of a room where paper had been accumulating for 40 years, and the organization of it had become its own kind of faith. Thaddeus asked for the certified water rights survey for the Crow East Boundary claim. The younger clerk looked up with the mild resistance of someone accustomed to requests that complicated their morning. That file's been pulled recently, the clerk said. For review. Pulled by who? Thaddeus said. The clerk went to the log and ran his finger down the page. By an agent of Vane Land and Debt Holdings. Yesterday afternoon. Is it back? Frick said. Yes, sir. Reviewed and returned same day. Then I need to see it, Thaddeus said. The clerk retrieved the file. Frick took it and opened it on the counter and found the certified survey page, and ran his finger down to the completion date and stopped. He looked at Marin. Marin looked at the date. October 14th. The lien had been filed October 26th, 12 days after the survey completion, 2 days outside the permitted window. She had calculated 11 days when she had worked from the ledger figures. The actual gap was larger because she had been measuring from the lien recording date rather than the certified survey stamp. 2 days, not 1. Frick looked at Thaddeus. The lien is void, he said. Flat and certain. Vane's people looked at this file yesterday, which means they know exactly what it shows. Then why did they file the notice inquiry anyway? Thaddeus said. Because they are betting you do not know, Frick said. If the demand notice goes out and you are scrambling to cover the debt, you will not have the time or the resources to examine the procedural history of a water rights filing from 4 months ago. Most men in your position would not. Thaddeus was quiet for 3 full seconds. "What do I need to file?" he said. A challenge to the second lien citing the law letter, and a formal objection to the third lien on procedural grounds. Frick said, "I can draft both documents here. You sign them and we file them at this office before close of business today. When Vane's demand notice arrives, it lands in the middle of active legal challenges he cannot simply override." "Do it," Thaddeus said. Frick looked at the clerk. "I will need use of your table." The clerk, who had been following this conversation with increasing attention, nodded and stepped back. Marin sat in the chair nearest the window while Frick drafted. She watched the street outside. Thaddeus stood at the counter reading every word as Frick wrote it, asking questions in a low voice and receiving precise answers. The morning moved forward with the particular momentum of a situation that has finally, after too long pointing in the wrong direction, begun to move the right way. She was watching the street when she saw the rider. He came from the south end of town, well-dressed, moving with purpose, a leather satchel across his saddle. He was looking at building numbers. She recognized the type before she recognized the specific situation. A man carrying legal documents for service, moving toward a destination he already knew. She stood up. She crossed to Thaddeus and touched his arm. He looked at her. She pointed at the window. He looked. The rider had stopped in front of the law office 2 doors down from the recorder's building. He dismounted and went inside. "That is Vane's courier," Frick said from the table. He had looked up and seen it too. "He is picking up the notice for service. Once he has it signed by Vane's attorney, it goes out immediately." "How long?" Thaddeus said. 10 minutes. Perhaps 15. Frick was already writing faster. Marin looked at the door across the street and counted the way she counted everything, steadily, without visible urgency, while internally running the arithmetic of every possible outcome. A challenge filed before service reversed the legal sequence entirely. A challenge filed after service gave Vane control of the timing. This was going to come down to minutes, and she understood that completely, and kept her face showing nothing of what she understood. "Done," Frick said. He turned the papers. Thaddeus read them with the focused thoroughness of a man who trusted no document he had not read completely, then picked up the pen and signed both with the decisive finality of someone who had been waiting for something to fight and had finally found it in the right place. "File them," Thaddeus said. Frick took both documents to the clerk. Marin watched the clerk's hands. She watched the stamp come down on the first document, then the second. The clerk wrote the time in the log, 10:47 in the morning. Across the street, the courier emerged from the law office with a document in hand. He mounted his horse. He pulled a paper from his coat and looked at it. He turned north. Frick watched him go. Then he looked at Thaddeus. "He is riding to your ranch," Frick said. "He will serve whoever is present on the property." He paused. "But it does not matter. Both challenges are filed and time-stamped at 10:47. When Vane's attorney receives those filing receipts, he is going to have a very unpleasant afternoon." Thaddeus stood at the counter and said nothing for a moment. Then he picked up his hat. He turned and looked at Marin, and the look on his face was something she had not prepared for and could not quite put a name to. Stripped down and direct and carrying considerably more weight than any expression she had seen him wear before. "We need to talk," he said. She wrote, "Yes, we do." They left Frick with instructions to send copies to Law's office and walked out into the cold morning air, and Thaddeus turned toward a side street rather than back toward the horses, and Marin understood this meant he wanted this conversation without the main street watching it. She followed him. He stopped. He turned to face her. He took off his hat and held it in both hands, which she had come to understand was what Thaddeus Crow did when he was about to say something that was going to cost him something. You went to see a lawyer before you had been on my ranch 3 weeks. He said, you found the law letter in my cabinet. You identified the water rights filing error from figures in a ledger I did not even know you had seen. You hid the portfolio from Vane's men when they came to take it. He paused. And you did all of this while every person on that ranch, including me, believed you could not hear a word anyone said. Marin held his gaze. Can you hear me right now? He said. The street was quiet. A wagon passed at the far end. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. She held the look for the longest moment she had allowed herself since the first day. Then she nodded. Thaddeus looked at her. He breathed. He looked at his hat and then back at her, and the expression on his face moved through several things in rapid succession. Things she watched cross him one after another, none of them landing where she had expected. How long, he said. She wrote. From the first day, he was still. Pruitt set up the arrangement. He said, not a question. She wrote, he told me it would go smoother. I let him think I agreed. Thaddeus looked at what she had written for a long time. Then he looked up. What were you planning, he said, when you came here? What were you actually planning to do? Marin looked at him steadily. She wrote slowly, choosing each word. I had no plan at first. I had a situation. The plan came after I understood yours. Thaddeus read that, then read it again. My situation, he said. She wrote, I heard everything from the first morning. The debt, Vane, the timeline. I understood what was coming before you did. And I had information you could not easily get yourself, so I used it. He was quiet for a moment. You decided what I could handle, he said. She met his eyes and wrote the truest thing she could write in that moment. I decided what the situation required. I made the best judgment I had with the information I had. I am not going to tell you I was wrong about the timing because I do not think I was, but I am telling you now, all of it, because the timing is right and because you deserve it, and because I am not interested in managing you anymore. The last sentence sat between them. Thaddeus looked at her for a long time. You could have told me, he said, any of it, from the beginning. She wrote, you would not have trusted me. You barely looked at me the first week. He had no answer for that because it was true and they both knew it. I owe you an apology for that, he said. A man shouldn't look at a person the way I looked at you those first days. You came onto my property with nothing, less than nothing. And you spent weeks working to save something that wasn't even yours to save while I walked past you, like you were part of the furniture. Marin looked at him steadily and wrote, you stopped walking past me. Something moved in his expression. He stood in that quiet side street in Delwood, Kansas, in the cold October air, holding his hat in both hands. And he looked at her the way a man looks at something he is only now, after too long, actually seeing. Marin, he said, just her name. She looked at him. I need to hear your voice, he said. I need to know what it sounds like. Marin stood on the street and felt the full weight of the moment and everything that had built toward it. Weeks of silence and strategy and invisible work. She made a choice. My name is Marin Holt, she said. I have been able to hear since the day I was born. And I have been listening to you, Thaddeus Crow, since the first morning I made biscuits in your kitchen. Her voice was clear and steady and entirely her own. Thaddeus looked at her like a man who has just heard something he cannot unhear and would not choose to. Lord, he said softly. I am sorry for the deception, she said, not for what I did with it. He was quiet. He turned his hat in his hands. I am not asking you to be sorry for it, he said finally. He stopped, started again. What do you want? From here, now that. He gestured between them. and she understood the gesture encompassed considerably more than the morning's legal work. Maren looked at him. She thought about the challenges filed at 10:47. She thought about a courier riding north toward a ranch where the notice would arrive too late to matter. She thought about a man who had said that won't happen again with his hand on a doorframe and had meant every syllable of it. "I want to stay," she said. "Not as the deaf woman in the bunkhouse. As someone who has a place here that means something." Thaddeus looked at her for a long, unblinking moment. "You already have a place there," he said. "You built it while I was not paying enough attention to see it." He put his hat on. "When we get back," he said, "you are going to tell me everything you know, every conversation you heard, every document you read, every piece of Vane's plan that you figured out. All of it," she said. He nodded once. "Then let's ride." He was already turning toward the horses when Spur Giddens came around the corner at a pace that said the news he was carrying was not good and had not gotten better on the way here. Spur pulled up when he saw them, breathing hard, his wrapped arm held against his side. "Vane's men," he said to Thaddeus, getting the words out before he had fully stopped moving. "Not the two from before. 5 of them. They rode in about an hour after you left, saying they have authority to survey the east boundary, claiming Vane is exercising his rights under the water claim." "He cannot," Frick said. He had followed them out and stood now in the street, still holding his coat half-buttoned and the filing receipts in one hand. "The challenge is filed. He has no legal authority to survey anything on that property until the matter is resolved before a judge. They do not know that," Spur said. "They will," Thaddeus said. He looked at Maren. "Everything," he said. "On the ride back. I need all of it." "All of it," she said. And Thaddeus Crow was already moving toward the horses, and Maren followed him, and she felt the ground shifting beneath everything. Not the destabilizing shift of something going wrong, but the decisive, irreversible shift of something finally going right. And she had been working in silence for 29 days, and the silence was done. And what came next would require every piece of intelligence she had gathered and every plan she had built alone in a kitchen while a ranch ran smoother around her and a man slowly, without meaning to, stopped looking through her and started looking at her instead. They rode hard back to the Crow Ranch, and Maren told him everything on the way, not in the careful, measured pieces she had been rationing for weeks, but all of it, straight and fast, the way you speak when caution has finally run out of time to be useful. She told him about the third lien and the filing date and the 10-day window she had calculated from the ledger figures before she had the certified survey stamp to confirm it. She told him what Vane's men had said in the kitchen when they believed she could not hear them. End of the week, bleeding him out, taking the water first. She told him about the second visit to Frick and the specific statutory language around notice requirements and the margin she had identified between what Vane had filed and what the law actually permitted. She told him about the portfolio and why she had moved it and where she had put it and how long it had been behind the flour sacks. Thaddeus listened without interrupting. He rode and he listened, and his jaw was set in the particular way she had come to know meant he was absorbing and cataloging, and not yet ready to respond, because he was still taking it all in and fitting it against what he already knew. When she finished, the ranch road was visible ahead, a pale line between the brown fields, and beyond it the roofline of the main house and the top of the barn. He said, "How long did you know about the water filing error?" 4 days, she said. He nodded once, a short nod, the kind that said he had heard it and placed it and was not stopping there. "And Vane's men in the kitchen, you heard them say end of the week." "Yes." "You hid the portfolio before they searched the main room." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." "Just that?" "Good." The way a man says a word when it covers more than the word usually carries. They came into the yard at a canter, and Maren counted 5 horses she did not recognize tied at the east fence. Good horses, well kept, belonging to men who were paid well enough to care about their animals. Spur Giddens was on the porch with his arms crossed and his wrapped arm held carefully. Tolliver stood near the barn door with the wide eyes of someone who had been watching a situation develop and did not know how it was going to end. Wick Reese sat on the porch steps with his forearms on his knees and his head not quite raised, the posture of a man who was ashamed of something he had not yet figured out how to fix. 2 of Vane's men were in the yard. A third was coming around from the east side with a measuring rod in his hand. A 4th stood near the water trough watching the road. The 5th man stood in the center of the yard with the particular stillness of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in any space he occupied. He was in his early 60s, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with the groomed and settled authority of a man who had possessed money long enough that it had become indistinguishable from his posture. He wore a coat that cost more than anything in the Crow House, and he stood in the yard of the ranch he intended to own as though he were already considering where to put things differently. Cornelius Vane. Maren had not expected him to come himself. Men who operated the way Vane operated sent representatives. They arranged things from offices. They did not stand in muddy yards in October wearing Saint Louis wool. The fact that he was here meant one of 2 things he was very certain. Or he had become impatient. And impatience in a man like Vane was not weakness, but it was information. Thaddeus pulled up and dismounted without hurrying. Maren dismounted beside him. Vane looked at Thaddeus first. Then his gaze moved to Maren. She was a large woman in a worn canvas coat and a work dress that had seen 2 seasons, standing in the mud of a Kansas ranch yard with her hands at her sides and her eyes on his face. He looked at her the way men like Vane look at things they have already decided are not relevant. And then he looked again, because something in her stillness was refusing to be irrelevant. He looked at her the way a man looks when a variable he had not considered has appeared in a situation he believed he had already fully mapped. "Crow," Vane said. His voice was pleasant and measured. The voice of a man who had long ago learned that composure was more frightening than anger. "I apologize for arriving without more notice. My men are completing a preliminary survey of the east boundary water claim. Standard procedure when a debt instrument approaches its resolution point." "Resolution point," Thaddeus said. He walked forward until the distance between them was the distance of a direct conversation rather than a yard. "That is an interesting way to describe taking a man's water." "It is an accurate description of a legal process," Vane said. "So is this." Thaddeus reached into his coat and produced the filing receipts Frick had handed him outside the recorder's office. He held them out flat, not quite offering, more presenting. The way you present something to a man and watch his face at the moment he understands what he is looking at. Vane took them. He read. Maren watched his face with the attention she had given to every face on this property for 29 days. He was good. The reaction was contained and small, a slight stillness behind the eyes, a fractional adjustment around the mouth. But it was there. She caught it. She suspected Thaddeus caught it too. "A challenge to the second lien," Vane said. His voice remained even. "And an objection to the water rights filing." He lowered the papers. "Mr. Crow, this is a delaying measure. It will not change the underlying." "It is filed and time-stamped," Thaddeus said. 10:47 this morning. Your courier was still in your attorney's office collecting the notice for service when those documents hit the county recorder's desk." He paused. "You have no legal authority to survey anything on this property until those challenges are resolved. I would like your men to stop what they are doing." Vane looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Maren. Really looked. The kind of looking that had assessment in it, reassessment, the rapid revision of a man who has been operating on an assumption that has just been shown to be incorrect. "Your deaf woman," Vane said slowly. "She was here when my men came 2 days ago. She was," Thaddeus said. "The documents my men came to collect were not available, Asmal. They were not." Vane looked at Marin with an expression that had something cold in it. Not anger, colder than anger. The recognition of a man who has been outmaneuvered and is determining precisely by whom. "She moved them," Vane said. "I expect she did." Thaddeus said, "Steady. Flat. Not a thread of apology in it, and not a thread of performance either. Just a man stating a fact about a person he was standing beside." Vane handed the receipts back. He looked at his men and made a small gesture, the kind of gesture that men with his particular kind of authority make when they want something stopped without the theatrics of a direct order. The measuring rod went down. The men in the yard became still. The one coming around the east side of the house stopped where he was. "This is not concluded," Vane said to Thaddeus. "No," Thaddeus agreed. "It is not. But the ground is different than it was this morning, and you know that." Vane adjusted his coat. He was a man who was doing arithmetic in real time, patient and methodical, the arithmetic of someone who had not survived in his particular business by reacting badly to unexpected information. "The second lien challenge, he said. "The law letter. The witness signature. Someone found it," Thaddeus said. Vane's gaze moved to Marin one more time, slower than before. He was a man who had spent 30 years in rooms making calculations about people, and the calculation he was making now, about a large, broad-shouldered woman in a work dress who had dismantled 2 of his legal instruments from inside a ranch kitchen while pretending she could not hear, was one he had not run before and was not certain he knew how to complete. "Pruitt told me she could not hear," Vane said, not quite to Thaddeus, directed somewhere between them. "Pruitt was wrong about several things," Thaddeus said. Vane looked at Marin directly. She held his gaze without moving. He put his hat on. He turned and walked to his horse, and his men followed, and the yard rearranged itself around their departure without anyone speaking. In under 3 minutes, all 5 of them were riding south down the ranch road, and the sound of their horses faded into the flat Kansas afternoon and was gone. The yard went quiet. Spur Giddens let out a breath that sounded like it had been stored for an hour at least. He sat down on the porch step with the deliberate lowering of a man whose legs have decided they are done with the standing portion of this particular event. Tolliver made a sound that started as a laugh and did not quite know what to do with itself after that. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth and looked at Marin with wide-open eyes that held something young and genuine in them. Wick Reese stood up from the steps slowly. He looked at Marin with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the thin amusement of a man looking at something he had already categorized. Something that was still moving, still settling, still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. He did not say anything. He picked up his hat from the step and put it on and walked toward the barn. And the walking toward the barn rather than away from the yard was, from Wick Reese, a statement of something. Thaddeus stood in the yard and looked at Marin, and she looked back at him, and between them was everything that had happened in the last 4 hours and everything that had happened in the last 29 days, and neither of them tried to make it smaller than it was. Inside, Thaddeus said to the yard, "All of you, Marin is going to tell us what she knows, and then we are going to figure out what comes next." They gathered in the main room, all 5 of them, crowded and mismatched. Spur in the chair by the window, Tolliver on the floor with his back against the wall, Wick Reese standing near the door with his arms crossed in the manner of a man who is listening harder than his posture suggests, and Thaddeus at the table across from Marin. She laid it all out, not the fragmented pieces she had assembled in private, but organized and complete. The way you lay out a map when people need to see the whole of it at once. The debt structure, the 3 liens, the filing errors in the second and third, what Vane's men had said in the kitchen when they believed no one was listening, what Frick had confirmed at the county recorder's office that morning, what the judge would need to see, what the timeline required. She told it plainly, without embellishment, because plain was what the situation needed, and because these men, Spur with his careful worry, Tolliver with his open face, Wick Reese listening with his jaw set in the manner of a man channeling something through his attention, and Thaddeus not taking his eyes from her since she had begun. These men deserved the plain version. When she finished, Spur said, "The water lien is void." Procedurally, yes, Marin said. A judge has to confirm it, but Frick is confident. The filing date is documented and the window requirement is in the statute. There is no ambiguity. And the second lien, Wick Reese said. He said it from the doorway without preamble, without the thin overlay of amusement that had been his default register since she arrived. Just the question, direct and serious. Challenged on the witness signature, Marin said. Lawway's assessment gives it strong grounds. Again, a judge decides. But Vane knows the challenge has merit. That is why he came himself today. He wanted to see how much we knew. And now he knows. Thaddeus said. Yes, Marin said. Which changes his calculation. He can fight 2 legal challenges simultaneously, but it costs him time and money, and the outcome is uncertain. That is a different position than he was in this morning, when he believed he had a clear path to the water, and from there to everything else. Spur leaned forward. So what does he do now? He looks for another angle, Marin said. Vane is patient. He will not abandon 2 liens because we filed challenges. He will look for something to accelerate the situation or complicate our position. She looked at Thaddeus. What we do in the next 2 weeks matters. What do we do? Thaddeus said. We need law in front of a judge as quickly as possible on the second lien challenge. The sooner the invalid witness signature is ruled on, the sooner Vane loses that instrument entirely. With the second lien voided and the third challenged, the first lien is the only debt he has legitimate standing on. She paused. The first lien has a standard repayment structure, aggressive but real. If we can make consistent payments on it, even partial ones, we demonstrate good faith, and it becomes very difficult for Vane to argue for accelerated collection on a debt that is being serviced. Tolliver said, "Can we make those payments?" Spur looked at Thaddeus. Thaddeus looked at Marin. The lease on the Galt North pasture, Marin said. If the Galt family still holds it, it may be available. Better grazing than the north section here. Per head production increases without purchasing new stock. Wick Reese uncrossed his arms. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he said, "I know the Galt family. I can ride out there this week." Nobody at the table said anything about that. Nobody needed to do that, Thaddeus said. The meeting broke up gradually. Spur toward the telegraph office to wire Law's office with the morning's developments. Tolliver to see to the horses and the survey markers Vane's men had been approaching on the east boundary. Wick Reese out the door with the slightly dazed purposefulness of a man who has found a way to make a thing right that he had not known needed making right until an hour ago. Thaddeus did not leave. He sat at the table while the room emptied and the house settled back into its ordinary sounds. The wind on the north wall, the creak of the porch, the distant movement of cattle somewhere in the afternoon. Marin cleared the table. "You ran the whole thing," Thaddeus said. She looked at him. "The legal research, the timing, the documents." hiding the portfolio, finding the law letter, calculating the filing error, all of it, from a kitchen, while pretending you could not hear the conversation happening 5 feet away. Marin looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he said. "After you found the law letter, after you knew about the water lien. Why did you wait?" Marin sat down across from him and thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you were a man who had not opened a letter from his own attorney," she said. "Not because you were careless, because you were so deep in the daily work of keeping this place alive that a legal letter had become one more thing you could not afford to know." She met his eyes. "If I had walked into your study 3 weeks ago and told you I could hear everything and your water rights lien was procedurally void, you would have spent the first hour managing your reaction to who I was instead of moving on the information. I needed you moving, not standing still in the middle of it." Thaddeus looked at her. "That is a very clear-eyed calculation," he said. "Yes," she said. "You decided what I could handle. I decided what the situation required." Marin said, "Those are not the same thing. And I am telling you now, all of it, openly, because the timing is right and because you deserve it, and because I am not interested in managing you anymore. That part is done." He was quiet for a long moment. Something in his face eased, a thing that had been held carefully in place, and the easing of it changed the whole quality of how he was sitting across from her. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward evening, and the ranch was going about its business with the ordinary persistence of a place that had, for the moment, exhaled. Thaddeus stood and crossed to the window and looked out at the yard where Tolliver was checking the east fence markers and Spur was walking toward the bunkhouse. "When Pruitt brought you here," Thaddeus said, not turning from the window, "what were you running from?" Marin had not expected that question now. She sat with it for a moment. "A situation I had made too small for myself," she said. "A boarding house and a set of walls that had no edges to them." She paused. "I am not running from anything anymore." He turned then. He looked at her across the room with that open, unguarded look, the one that had been appearing in fragments for weeks and was now, for the first time, complete. "What are you running toward?" he said. Marin held the look. "I will tell you when I am certain," she said. "But I think you already have a sense of it." Thaddeus was still for a moment. Then he said, "I owe you more than I can put a number on. The ranch, the filings, the documents, all of it. I know that. But that is not what I'm talking about." He stopped. He started again, and the starting again cost him something, which she recognized and valued because it meant what was coming next was real. "I looked at you the first day like you were a solution to a problem someone else had partially solved for me." He said, "You spent nearly a month saving something I barely acknowledged you were part of." "You acknowledged me," she said. "You asked if I was all right. You told Reese it would not happen again. You said my name like it had weight." She looked at him steadily across the kitchen. "Those things are not nothing, Thaddeus." He looked at her. "No," he said. "But they were not enough either." "No," she agreed. "But they were a start." The word start sat between them and opened into something that neither of them moved to close. He crossed the room to the table and stopped close enough that there was no longer any performance of distance between them. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not in the bunkhouse, not as a worker. I want you to have a place here that is yours, that no one, not Pruitt, not Vane, not any arrangement or contract can assign or remove." He held her gaze. "I am asking you to help me build one, for both of us, if that is something you want." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, Tolliver was talking to one of the horses in the low, easy way he always did. and the sound of it came through the wall like something permanent. He stood close enough that there was no longer any performance of distance between them. He did not say anything more for a moment. Neither did she. The kitchen held the silence the way it held everything else that evening, with the particular steadiness of a place that has been through something and is still standing. Then he put his hat back on and walked toward the door. At the threshold he turned once, just briefly, with the look she had come to know as the one he wore when something had settled in him that he had not expected to settle. She turned back to the stove. Outside, the first stars were appearing over the Kansas plain, cold and clear and entirely indifferent to the fact that something in this kitchen had just changed into something it was not going to change back from. 14 days later, the letter from Law's office arrived on a Tuesday morning. Tolliver brought it in from town still in his riding coat, moving with the particular energy of a young man carrying information he knows is significant and cannot wait to set down. He handed it to Thaddeus in the yard, and Thaddeus read it standing in the cold morning light with Marin beside him, and she watched his face move through the reading, the way she had watched his face move through things for 6 weeks now, with the full attention of someone who had learned its particular language. The news was good. Law had submitted the challenge to the second lien with the complete documentation, the witness signature discrepancy, the county filing regulations, the supporting case precedents from similar disputes in the territory. The presiding judge had reviewed the preliminary submission and responded in a manner Law described as unusually direct and decisive. The judge wanted both parties before him in 14 days for a formal hearing. He had issued a temporary stay on all debt collection activity related to the second lien pending that hearing. Thaddeus lowered the letter. 14 days, Bill, he said. Lawe presented it compellingly. Marin said, "The stay is significant. Vane cannot move on the second lien until after the hearing, and the water rights objection." Thaddeus said, "Still working through the procedural queue," she said. "But if the judge rules on the second lien first and voids it, Vane goes into the water rights hearing having already lost one instrument. That changes the posture of everything that follows." Thaddeus looked at the letter again. "You have been thinking about this constantly," he said. She almost said no and then decided that honesty was the arrangement they were operating under now. "Yes," she said. "What do we need for the hearing?" he said. "Law has the letter and the filing documentation," she said. "Frick will testify about the witness signature requirement. What strengthens us additionally is any record of how Vane has used this lien structure before. If he has employed the same irregular filing method on another property, it demonstrates a pattern rather than an isolated error. Pattern suggests intent rather than oversight. Intent changes what a judge can do with it." Thaddeus looked at her. "Eustace Galt," he said. Marin looked at him. "When Vane took the Galt Ranch 2 years ago," Thaddeus said, slower now, thinking through it as he spoke. "Eustace mentioned once that the paperwork had come together fast, unusually fast for a transaction that size. I thought he was looking for an explanation that wasn't his own choices. But if Vane's lien on the Galt property used the same witness signature arrangement, if Eustace still has his copies," Marin said. Thaddeus was already turning toward the house. "I will send a wire today." The wire went out before noon. Eustace Galt's reply came 4 days later, carried in from Delwood by Tolliver, who handed it to Marin because Thaddeus was in the South Field and Tolliver had, over the preceding weeks, developed an instinct for whose hands certain things should reach first. Marin read it at the kitchen table. Eustace had kept his copies. Of course he had. A man who loses his land does not surrender the paperwork that explains how, because the paperwork is the only remaining testimony to what happened to him and why it was not entirely his fault, and some part of him needs that testimony to exist, even when no one is asking to read it. In those copies, clearly documented, was a witness signature on Vane's lien instrument that followed the same pattern as the one on the Crow second lien. One witness signing on behalf of a third party, the same procedural violation, a different ranch. 2 years earlier. Pattern. Thaddeus read the letter in the yard when he came back in at dusk. Standing with his coat still on and the letter in both hands, he knew the witness signature was invalid when he filed it. Thaddeus said, "Yes," Marin said. He filed it that way because most men would not find the problem before he moved on them. Yes. Thaddeus set the letter down on the porch rail. He looked out at the property, the barn, the fence line, the darkening sky to the east over the creek. "How many?" he said. "I do not know," Marin said. "But at least 2 that we can document. That is enough for a judge to see the shape of what Vane does." Thaddeus picked up the letter. "Wire Law tonight," he said. "He needs the Galt documentation before the hearing. The wire went out after supper." Eustace Galt sent his original documents by courier a week later, arriving 2 days before the hearing with time for Law to have them certified and prepared. The night before the hearing, they sat in Law's office until close to midnight, all of them, Thaddeus and Marin and Frick and Law himself, a thin, precise man in his 50s who looked at Marin across the table in the second hour and said without preamble, "You are the one who identified the filing window on the water rights lien." "Yes," Marin said. "From the ledger figures," Law said. "Before you had the certified survey to confirm it." Frick quoted the window requirement to me, she said. "I calculated the dates from the ledger and then confirmed against the survey stamp at the recorder's office. And the Galt connection," Law said. "Thaddeus made that connection," she said. "He knew the Galt family. He understood the timeline." Lawe looked at Thaddeus, then back at Marin. "Regardless," he said, "what we have is 3 distinct lines of argument. The invalid witness signature on the second lien, the Galt precedent establishing deliberate pattern, and the water rights filing outside the statutory window. Vane will be defending on all 3 simultaneously." He paused. "He will come into that courtroom with something," Law said. "He will not come empty-handed. He will try to make this hearing about the debt itself, about the financial condition of this ranch." Marin had been thinking about this for 3 days. "Then we show he can meet it," she said. Law looked at her. "The cattle prices are down but not gone," she said. "The Galt North pasture lease expands the grazing and increases per head production without new stock. Wick Reese has the terms confirmed. 3 months of consistent partial payments on the first lien demonstrate good faith and active management." She paused. "I have been tracking household expenditures since I arrived. I can document the savings. It is not a large figure, but it is real and it is documented, and it shows a ranch that is being managed carefully, not abandoned." Law looked at her for a long moment. "You have been keeping records of household expenditures," he said. "I keep records of everything." Marin said, "Frick," who had been quiet at the end of the table for the past 20 minutes, made a sound that was mostly suppressed and entirely genuine. Law looked at Thaddeus. "Is she always like this?" he said. "Yes," Thaddeus said. And something in the way he said it, simple and certain and without any performance at all, made Marin look at the papers in front of her for a moment to collect herself before she looked back up. The hearing was on a Thursday. The courtroom in Delwood was small and functional, built for the practical administration of county business rather than ceremony, and it held considerably more people than debt proceedings typically attracted. Word had traveled the way word travels in small places, efficiently and with embellishment, and the benches behind the bar held ranchers and townspeople, and 2 men Marin recognized as neighboring landowners who had dealt with Vane's lending operation in previous years. They sat with the particular attention of people who have a personal stake in how a story ends. Cornelius Vane arrived with 2 attorneys. He sat at the opposing table with the composed authority of a man who had been in courtrooms before and found them manageable. When Marin came in beside Thaddeus and Law, Vane's gaze moved to her and rested there for a moment longer than it had rested on anyone else in the room. He was still recalibrating. She could see it. Judge Eunice Aldrin took the bench at exactly 9 in the morning. She was in her early 60s, silver-haired, with the brisk, precise manner of someone who had spent a career in rooms where men underestimated her and had developed no patience for the process. She read the preliminary submissions without expression. She called the room to order in a voice that did not require volume to carry. Vane's attorneys moved immediately to make the hearing about the debt. They were thorough and well-prepared, presenting the first lien's terms and the payment history with the efficient confidence of men who had made this argument in rooms like this before and found it worked. The ranch owed money. The money had not been fully paid. The creditor had legal standing. Lowe let them finish. Then he stood and said, "Your Honor, we are not here to dispute the first lien. We are here because the instruments Mr. Vane is relying upon to accelerate collection are procedurally defective and in at least one instance were filed in deliberate violation of county statute." Judge Aldrin looked at him over her spectacles. "Proceed," she said. Law laid it out with the methodical precision of a man who had spent a week preparing for exactly this room and this moment. The witness signature on the second lien, the regulation, the Galt precedent with Eustace Galt's certified documents submitted as evidence, the water rights filing date, and the 10-day window. 3 arguments, clean and clear, each one standing on documented evidence rather than interpretation. Vane's attorneys objected twice on procedural grounds. Judge Aldrin overruled both times with a brevity that suggested she had formed a view before the objections arrived, and the objections had not improved it. Then Vane's lead attorney said, "Your Honor, regardless of the procedural questions around the secondary instruments, the underlying debt is real and the ranch's financial condition demonstrates a clear inability to service even the primary obligation." Judge Aldrin looked at Law. "Response," she said. Lowe looked at Marin. Marin stood. The sound in the room was small and immediate, a collective shift in attention. She was a large woman, broad through the shoulders and solid through the middle, and she rose from her chair in a Kansas County courtroom in 1879 with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has been underestimated in every room she has ever entered and has learned to use the moment of underestimation before it corrects itself. The room adjusted. Vane's attorney looked at her with an objection forming on his face, saw something in her expression, and the objection arrived a half-second late. "Miss Holt is a material witness to the ranch's financial management," Law said. "She has prepared documentation relevant to the court's assessment of the ranch's operating condition." "I will hear it," Judge Aldrin said. She looked at Marin over her spectacles, and something in that look was direct and specific in a way that had nothing to do with legal procedure. It was the look of a woman who had spent a career being the unexpected person in a room and had learned to identify that quality in others the moment it appeared. Marin stood in that courtroom and spoke clearly and without hesitation. She presented the household records, 3 months of documented expenditures, methodical and specific. She presented the Galt North pasture lease terms and the projected increase in grazing capacity. She presented the payment schedule Thaddeus had maintained on the first lien, partial, consistent, uninterrupted through the difficult season, and she presented the survey completion date and the filing date and the 10-day statutory window, laid side by side. The arithmetic requiring no interpretation, only reading. She laid all of it on the record without drama and without apology, and without once looking away from the judge. When she finished, the room was quiet. Judge Aldrin looked at the documents. She looked at Vane's table. She looked at Thaddeus. Then she looked at Marin. "You compiled this yourself," she said. "Yes, Your Honor." "While employed at the ranch as domestic staff?" "Yes." Judge Aldrin held her gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. "Noted," Judge Aldrin said. "She ruled from the bench that afternoon. The second lien was voided on procedural grounds. The witness signature violation was confirmed. The Galt precedent was admitted as evidence of deliberate pattern, and the judge used the word deliberate in her ruling, which Law had told them was significant, and which Frick, sitting in the gallery, received with a visible exhale. The water rights lien was referred to a separate proceeding with a strong preliminary finding in Crow's favor. Judge Aldrin noted the filing date discrepancy in specific language and directed the county recorder to flag the instrument pending full resolution. The first lien stood. The debt was real, and Vane's standing on it was legitimate. But without the water lever and without the second lien's acceleration mechanism, it was a manageable obligation, not comfortable, not easy, but survivable, and Vane had no path to rapid foreclosure. When the judge rose, the room moved the way rooms move when something that has been pressing against them from one side has finally shifted. One of the neighboring landowners in the back row, a man who had watched the proceedings with an attention that went beyond casual interest, leaned across to the man beside him and said something in a low voice. Two ranchers near the window stood without speaking and looked at each other with the particular look of men who are filing information away for a conversation they will have later and privately. Whatever Vane had been doing to the land around Delwood, whatever arrangements he had been running on other properties in other counties, the shape of it was visible now to anyone in that room who had been paying attention, and most of them had been paying attention. Vane's attorneys gathered their papers with the practiced composure of men accustomed to losing without losing their composure. Vane himself sat for an additional moment, not deflated, not broken. He was not that kind of man, but still, recalculating. Then he stood and crossed the room and stopped on the bar side of the railing and looked at Thaddeus with the direct, unornamented regard of a man who has just discovered his opponent is more capable than he accounted for. "Your attorney is good," Vane said. "So is yours," Thaddeus said. Vane looked at Marin. "The filing window calculation?" he said. "That was yours." Marin met his gaze. "Yes," she said. Vane looked at her for a moment. He was a man who had spent 30 years making calculations about people, and the one he was completing now required revision of assumptions he had held since the moment Pruitt described a deaf, heavy-set kitchen woman who would not cause trouble. The cold, reluctant acknowledgment she had seen in the yard was more complete now. Less reluctant. "Pruitt told me you could not hear," he said. "Pruitt was wrong about a great many things." Marin said. Vane put on his hat. "The first lien," he said to Thaddeus. "Payments on schedule. You will have them." Thaddeus said. Vane walked out and his attorneys followed, and the room began to breathe again around their departure. Frick appeared at Marin's elbow. "When you came into my office that first Tuesday," he said, "I believed I was doing a small courtesy for a woman who needed information she could not easily find herself." He paused. "I was wrong about several aspects of that." "You gave me what I needed," Marin said. "That was the courtesy." Frick nodded slowly. Then he excused himself to speak with Law, and Marin turned and found Thaddeus standing directly behind her. He had been listening. Of course he had. He was looking at her with the full, open look, the one she had no defense against and had long since stopped trying to build one. "Ready to go home," he said. The word landed in her chest with the full weight of what it meant. Not a place he was describing, but a category he was including her in. "Yes," she said. "I am ready to go home." They rode back with all of them, Thaddeus and Marin and Spur Giddens and Tolliver and Wick Reese, who had come to the hearing without being asked and sat in the back row and said nothing, and whose presence had meant something. And the road was familiar now in a way that roads become familiar when you have traveled them in both directions for reasons that mattered. Tolliver made supper that evening. It was ambitious and imperfect and genuinely edible in most of its components, and nobody said a word about the parts that were not, because the effort was real and the evening was the kind that did not need perfect food. Spur raised his coffee cup at some point and said, "To the table in general and no one in particular, to the woman who heard everything." Wick Reese raised his cup without hesitation. Tolliver raised his, grinning, and did not say a word. Thaddeus raised his and looked at Marin across the table, and she looked back at him, and what passed between them in that look was not a declaration. It was something quieter and more permanent than a declaration, the acknowledgement of two people who have worked through something real together and have come out the other side changed by the working of it. Marin raised her cup. "To the ranch," she said. "And everyone at this table." Later, after the table was cleared and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the night had settled over the Crow property with the particular weight of a Kansas autumn evening. Marin was at the kitchen counter putting things in order when Thaddeus came back in from checking the horses. He stopped in the doorway. That particular pause. She turned. "I need to say something," he said. She waited. "When Pruitt brought you here," Thaddeus said, "I looked at you like a problem someone had partially solved for me. I want you to know that I know that, and I know it was wrong, and what you did for this place, what you gave it, was worth more than I had the sense to see coming." He held her gaze. "You saved this ranch," he said. "Not me, not Law or Frick. You. And I do not want a day to pass where that is not said plainly." Marin looked at him for a long moment. "It has been said," she told him quietly. "Good," he said. He did not move. She did not move. The kitchen held them both in the particular stillness of a moment that has been building through every other moment before it, and Marin understood that this was where it had been going all along. Not to the courtroom or the filing receipts or the legal victories. To this, a kitchen, a man telling the truth, a woman receiving it on ground she had helped build and now stood on without apology. "Partners, he said. "The real kind, with weight behind it. Partners, she said. "On my terms. I would not have it any other way, he said, and that was how it was settled. Not with ceremony or documents, but with two people standing in a kitchen that Marin had made functional, and Thaddeus had given her room to occupy, on a ranch that had come within days of being taken and had instead been kept, through the particular combination of a man's determination and a woman's intelligence and the truth that had finally, after too long in silence, been given its full and rightful voice. Outside, the Crow Ranch was quiet and intact and entirely theirs. Marin Holt had arrived with a canvas bag and the sharpest ears in the county, and she had built something no one had seen coming. Not Vane, not Pruitt, not even Thaddeus Crow, who should have known better than to underestimate the woman standing in his kitchen from the very first morning she put biscuits on his table and listened to everything and began, quietly and without announcement, to save everything he had.